Hello, welcome to today's Snack and Learn webinar. Just mentioning the housekeeping items briefly. The presentation slides are available to download in the handout box in the control panel as a PDF. And also there will be time for question and answers. If you can please log your questions in the question box on the control panel, and we will address these questions at the end of the presentation. And I will hand it over to Dana and Maya to start the presentation. Thank you.
Hello and welcome. I'm Maya Buchanan, Assistant Vice President in Sustainability, Energy, and Climate Change. I lead international assessment and advisory work on climate risk and adaptation for organizations and communities at WSP, and I serve as President of the Board on the American Society of Adaptation Professionals.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Dana Davis, and I too serve as an Assistant Vice President here in Sustainability, Energy, and Climate Change, or SECC. I focus on helping my clients understand and assess climate risks and opportunities and help them prepare for mandatory reporting requirements.
Today, we'll be giving a brief introduction to scenario analysis and discuss a case study highlighting approaches for conducting climate-related risk assessments that develop meaningful outcomes to operationalize climate risk. As global temperatures climb, widespread shifts in weather systems occur, making events like heat waves and wildfires more severe and frequent, and making other events like hurricanes and floods more intense and unpredictable. The change in these hazards have harmed many communities worldwide, resulting in losses of life, damages to infrastructure, and altered ecosystems. And extreme weather events that may have hit us once in our grandparents' lifetimes are becoming more common in ours. For example, the maximum heat experienced in July 2023 in the Western US and Mexico and Southern Europe would have been virtually impossible if humans had not warmed the climate by emitting greenhouse gases. Climate attribution studies show us that similar heat wave events are now expected to occur approximately every 10 to 15 years.
The physical impacts of climate change are increasingly apparent, and more of us, as noted by Maya, are directly experiencing them. But we also want to recognize that climate change also exacerbates other risk areas for organizations. For example, if we start at the box at the top, insurance companies are beginning to de-risk from certain geographic areas, like here in the United States, in Texas and California. Increasing insurance premium costs can force an organization to have to change its coverage options. This could mean accepting more risk or perhaps increasing the percentage of future funding that goes towards insurance premiums, or maybe even have to look for other insurance providers or even multiple providers to achieve the desired coverage. These changes can impact organizations through changes in lease agreements, increase future financial planning for asset insurance, and also may offer opportunities such as working to improve asset level resilience against climate hazards. Now we'll spend a little bit of time describing why interest and momentum to assess and disclose climate-related risks and opportunities is growing. Maya noted a couple minutes ago that climate change impacts are happening all around the world, and they're impacting people and companies, communities, and governments. Second, investors increasingly want to understand these risks so that they could allocate capital appropriately away from high-risk sectors or even potentially directly companies. In the third box, of course, in the United States, we have the final, although it's stayed, the final Securities and Exchange Commission climate disclosure rule and recently passed California laws. And of course, internationally, there has been lots of activities in the European Union, the United Kingdom, Australia, to name a few. And of course, there are opportunities, and opportunities are critical here. You may be asking, what are climate-related climate change opportunities? And what we mean by this is, how can an organization help facilitate an equitable low carbon transition, creating market opportunities for the organization along the way?
The extent to which current and future generations will experience a hotter and different world depends on choices now and in the near term. which make it very challenging for organizations and communities to prepare for extreme events without navigating deep uncertainty. For example, 2011 to 2022 was around 1.1 degrees C warmer than 1850 to 1900, but the extent of future warming could vary significantly, making all sorts of decisions regarding built environment design and planning very challenging. Scenario analysis is an approach that organizations and communities use to navigate this uncertainty in a measurable and actionable way.
The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, which is a very common and well-known climate risk disclosure framework, along with other frameworks and regulations, asks companies to conduct what's called a scenario analysis. This is an exercise and it's a tool that organizations use to explore a range of hypothetical climate-related outcomes, considering a range of future possible states. During a scenario analysis, we consider physical risks and opportunities, as well as transition risks and opportunities. In the visual at the bottom of the slide here, on the left, we take the organization as it is today, and we think through various scenarios that could unfold. So for example, maybe we globally take a lot of action and reduce GHG emissions, thereby slowing warming to a moderate level, or maybe we don't take enough action and warming is high by the end of the century. We then assess and consider how the organization would be impacted at different points in the future under these different scenarios. And we always like to remind organizations that we work with that scenarios are not forecasts and they do not have probabilities associated with them.
Okay, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the 6th Assessment Report Cycle defines core terms that make it possible to meaningfully and systematically assess climate risk. Hazard here is the potential occurrence of a physical event like a heat wave or trend like increasing temperatures over time that may cause loss of life, damage to property, and other impacts. And exposure is essentially the what, the presence of people, livelihoods, services, resources, infrastructure, or social or cultural assets in places and settings that could be adversely affected by a given hazard. Vulnerability is then the how, the propensity or predisposition of a setting or an asset to be adversely affected. Vulnerability considers characteristics that influence its susceptibility to harm or capacity to cope and adapt to the hazard at hand. Together, hazard, exposure, vulnerability represent risk inherent to the setting. And residual risk is the remaining risk remaining after the risk reduction efforts have been taken. These components of risk can become bespoke for a specific organization by considering the unique characteristics of its assets, its operations, and settings by engaging with the staff using climate data that is appropriate for the setting and the use case. So for example, in terms of spatial resolution and topography, and connecting the dots with additional subject matter experts, for example, bridge engineers, if considering the vulnerability of a particular bridge design to various flooding conditions.
Wonderful. Now we'll dive into a recent case study where we supported an organization who is in the financial services industry to help them conduct a physical and transition scenario analysis. For the discussion today, though, we're going to focus in on the methodologies we undertook to complete the physical risk and resilience assessment. The organization aimed to, number one, understand their climate risk and incorporate it into their existing enterprise risk management program. Number two, identify areas where they could build resilience to any identified climate hazards. And three, because they were being looped into a couple of different climate risk regulations and frameworks, they needed to assess their climate risk to prepare for disclosures. The following slides are going to break down the processes that we took to assess inherent risk and response. Next slide. Now, if you remember the equation slide that Maya just displayed a couple minutes ago, to understand inherent risk, we need to assess both exposure of the site and its vulnerability. As data inputs, we use three primary data sets as inputs: site level data, So these would be things like the latitude and longitude of the site, the function of the site, which is very important to understand. So for example, is it a manufacturing site or is it a data center? Or how are workers working in that site? And of course, any financial value data that is attached to that site. We use scenario data, the shared socioeconomic pathways, SSP5 8.5 and SSP2 4.5, and a set of climate indicators that are relevant to the site and function. For example, number of days with wet bulb temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit is a common indicator used with assets that are sensitive to humidity and also where there are employees who work outside. In terms of process, our team uses really a multifaceted approach to assess how future climate exposure could impact the sites. We use literature reviews and industry best practices, and most importantly, direct input and engagement with the subject matter experts within the organization and our own WSP subject matter experts, which oftentimes includes engineering specific subject matter experts who are familiar with particular building design and systems. Input from all of these sources help us understand the potential impact. We also align our exposure and vulnerability rating scales as needed to match those used directly by the organization in their enterprise risk management program, for example. The outputs from this work, we had a list of assets by assets of site vulnerability under different scenarios and across the different time horizons we were looking at. The data also provides a view into any regional hotspots of risk if there's particular geographic focus there. Next slide. For the response component of the work, next we focus on the resilience of the assets and the organization's portfolio of assets at large. First, we take the outputs from the previous slide and we conduct in-depth review of the most at-risk sites and their preparedness to prevent and manage, bounce back from, and recover from a climate-driven risk. And we do this by conducting site-level interviews and assessing additional data from the sites. Finally, the results of this process provide a view of the site of the asset's specific residual risk. It also can provide enterprise-wide level findings and awareness. And then we finalize the work by developing specific recommendations on additional ways to improve resilience for each site, as well as improve resilience across the enterprise-wide portfolio. All right, next slide. We have a couple of key takeaways or lessons learned from this work. What did we learn? We captured a few interesting insights here that we wanted to highlight. A couple of sites, we learned through the engagement that a couple of sites had already experienced weather-related impacts resulting in operational disruptions. The organization had emergency response plans, business continuity plans in place, but because of these recent events, they were actively trying to work to improve and enhance those plans. We also found, and this is very commonly found across our client base, that even if the organization has prepared its operations for disruptions and for business continuity, there are usually ways to better prepare the workforce, the employees, for the same hazards that the asset is going to face in the future. In terms of process, our methodologies focus on using interactive tools to engage a wide variety of employees within the organization. This is the age of the virtual webinar. So we use all the tips we can to keep audience engaged during these sessions, such as having all the cameras on as much as possible, which we find is very useful and helps kind of maintain that engagement. The engagements that we have with the site level staff through the site level resilience interviews are very critical in our process. And we find that the folks there at the sites that have that direct experience, the knowledge of the operations, the managers and the facility managers are critically helpful to really understand how that asset and that facility operates and the resulting resilience. And finally, we have to stay flexible and modify our approaches based on the organization's needs. We may have to work with international staff in many different time zones. And of course, our recommendations and our understanding of the site are oftentimes based off of the authority of the organization to affect change at the particular asset, which could be dependent on ownership status of the site or maybe leasee status. And so we always have to make sure that we tailor our process and findings to reflect, an owned site versus a leased site status. Okay, back to you, Maya.
Thanks, Dana. Another ongoing case study that is our work with the Water Research Foundation through the project Back in the Future. Across the world, water utilities face similar challenges in developing long-term plans and investment decisions. And utilities are actively exploring water infrastructure, how it can be expanded and upgraded now and in the coming years to meet the future needs and adapt to increasingly uncertain future risks related to changes in climate, but also supply and demand, regulations, economics, and aging infrastructure. There is a pressing need for integrating new approaches to effectively assess, communicate, manage, and mitigate emerging and future risks into their operations and planning. So the goal of this two-year study is to provide water utilities with vetted guidance that's co-produced with them from their experience on applying scenario and adaptive planning methods into long-term water supply planning, essentially to enhance their ability to adapt to changing conditions. Whereas scenario planning that we've been talking about involves exploring multiple potential futures, adaptive planning as a part of that includes iterative planning approaches that can help organizations remain flexible as the world becomes increasingly complicated. So to achieve this goal, we are partnering with 8 international water utilities in the US, Canada, and New Zealand, and international thought leaders as part of our technical advisory group. This includes Deltares, RAND, and universities. And together we are identifying use cases, best practices, challenges, and tools for applying scenario and adaptive planning approaches, and then synthesizing this information into an easy to follow framework to help guide decisions along each core step of scenario and adaptive planning. So using surveys, case study interviews, and drawing upon the academic literature, we aim to provide guidance that is useful for utilities of various contexts, so that if we can bring lessons learned regardless of where they are, whether they're deeply familiar or newer to these approaches or facing higher levels of resource constraints. And we'd like to thank you for joining us and happy to take your questions. Please do reach out to continue the conversation beyond today on how climate risks can be assessed and managed across sectors. And with that, over to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Maya and Dana, for a fantastic presentation. Just mentioning the housekeeping items briefly again, the presentation slides are available to download in the handout box as a PDF, and also please continue to log your questions in the question box on the control panel. I will start with the first question. Does the approach involve extreme precipitation indices, such as day 1 return period, 5-day return period, 95, 99 return period, consecutive dry days, etc.?
Great question, thank you. So we are not prescriptive about the particular indicators that are used. There are many available indicators for extreme precipitation and every climate hazard, and it's best practice to focus on the context first. So we do that, and then we select the indicators that are meaningful for the context at hand that relate to the key hazards, but really importantly, their interaction, right, with the entity and the impacts that are most critical for functionality and the well-being of the people there. So that could include any of the above that you mentioned, but also, different indicators that may be more relevant to the particular infrastructure or the access route, et cetera.
Thank you. What is the step-by-step guide to conduct risk assessment for even the smallest budget?
That's another great question. So you truly can scale any assessment. They follow the good thing about having a systematic methodology that's backed by the research literature and experts are in the field is that they're the same essential core steps that are outlined. It's a matter of scaling to the problem that you have at hand or how large of an entity you're looking at. So for example, you can scale down the dimensionality. You can focus on key hazards, key assets, main vulnerabilities of concern, things that are really business critical or community critical. For example, a hub that would be critical and have kind of ripple effects for the community at large. That might be a smart way to focus and get started. You could also reduce the number of engagement interviews you have, and there are other activities that you could adjust accordingly. So really, we use the word journey because you start with building a foundation and you can add details as you go along in future stages and ultimately making it a part of the way that you operate, just like you would with any other facet of risk, this one being a particularly complicated one. Thank you.
Thank you. For governmental clients, for example, city entities, how do you approach those clients building inventories and getting data through several different departments?
Yeah, so we can share this one, I imagine. So, there's often we see siloing of information, and part of a process like this that's really helpful is you actually kind of enhance that fabric, the social fabric within an organization, because this truly is a time and a subject that requires interdisciplinary perspectives and people working together that often speak very different technical languages. So I think bringing people together as part of a process, having their buy-in and motivation to get involved allows people to then talk about what the problem is. I really believe in the context first approach as opposed to science first, because you want to know what is the problem we're trying to solve. And from there, the data is a tool. It's a part of the process, but it's not the end goal. And you don't want to pick data that necessarily might not help support the issue that you're facing. Dana, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just jump in, and I don't even think that some of our clients who are not governmental have these challenges as well. So I would echo Maya's point about you actually using this as an opportunity to build that cohesion and that collaboration. We always encourage, where our clients deem appropriate, to involve as many key stakeholders as possible across the organization to really acclimate them and to start, bringing everybody up at a similar pace to enhance that climate risk and resilience understanding. So it's not unusual, and we do the best that we can working within the organization's restraints, if there truly are restraints we can't overcome.
Thank you. How do you best visualize your risk assessment methodologies for clients? For example, is it through impact analysis chains, simple visualization, etc.?
All of the above. Again, I like to speak to the context at hand. So for some people, they want a dashboard. They want something that they can pull information from frequently to think about how that can support some of their, decisions about whether or not they're going to renew working in a particular environment over time, or what adjustments might be needed. For other people, they really are creating new things, just like you would for any topic. So for example, resilience inventories of after you've prioritized the risk, what are those next steps, and how cost effective is a particular item, and does that actually work well with a different type of resilience measure from a different hazard or a different part of the organization. Maps can be really helpful, as well as decision trees, frameworks. Dana, feel free to add to that.
Yeah, I would just add to that, in addition to the visualizing, we really try and visualize based off of the audience and make it understandable and consumable so that the organization can take the results and really share it amongst the within the organization. But one note that I think is really key is that we aim for really that transparency in the methodology, that so you all have the information at hand. There's no really kind of black box as to how we got from step A to step B. That transparency, I think, has been very useful to our clients in understanding the methodology.
Fantastic, thank you. I will take the last question. This is regarding quantifying potential financial losses. I will read it. Have you ever had clients that are interested in quantifying potential financial losses associated with specific risks? To give an example here of flooding resulting in downtime at a mining site, for example. How have you approached this, and if so?
Dita, do you want to start that one? Or
you can, I can speak to it, and then Maya jump in as well. One of the first kind of key understandings for us when we start to move from a qualitative to a quantitative assessment is to understand, has there been any historical impacts? So by understanding really, have there been any historical impacts, gathering as much data about that, did it result in any kind of financial impact? Maybe not necessarily financial, maybe it was more of an internal time, a loss of time by people. Well, that certainly can be quantified into something that's more financially focused. So we first look backwards to see if there's any relevant data, also looking at literature, best practices, to understand kind of how those impacts might then manifest in a financial way. And then we work with the organization in a very collaborative way to build financial quantification methodologies that make sense to them, that then we can match to a future scenario and see how those financial projections of risk change over time. And we really focus on, it's a collaborative approach, because ultimately you have to make decisions for assumptions, building in assumptions of uncertainty and whatnot. And so getting that buy-in from the financial planning groups, et cetera, within the organization is really key in that part. But Maya, please add to that.
Yeah, I would just add that that's also where the transparency is really important, and building out essentially, micro calculations for every interaction of those dimensions, right? So there is a lot of literature that has some of those, empirical relationships, right, between extreme heat and mortality and morbidity, and what does that mean, for example, if you're working with a healthcare system in a southern environment that's very hot. So breaking down each one of those relationships and putting, a number or set of numbers behind it that's transparently reported, so that those can also be adjusted over time as an organization continues to better understand the risks that they face, and unfortunately likely will experience more extreme events and damages. I think of it as also building a foundation that can be adjusted over time as new information unfolds. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you, Maya and Dana, for a fantastic presentation. Thank you all for your questions. All additional questions that we were not able to answer will be answered directly by the presenters. You can see their contact details and feel free to reach out to them. So we will wrap up the session today. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you in our upcoming sessions. So thanks, everyone. We will wrap up the session now.